I was wrong. I made a mistake because last week I said that BYJU'S is a loss-making company worth $22 billion in a bear market with no clear exit strategy. And so investors aren't going to fall for that sunk cost fallacy for much longer. And also, I said that they might not even be able to pay salaries for April or May. I said this because I didn't think that it was likely that BYJU'S would be able to convince investors to give them more money. But I was wrong. That was a big mistake. And actually, BYJU'S has just raised a massive round of $700 million at the same valuation as their previous funding round and the funding round before that, $22 billion. So it looks like BYJU'S and Divya have been hard at work talking to VCs over the last couple of months. But the thing that we're not quite clear on yet is whether this amount is already in their bank account, the $700 million amount, or whether they're still in advanced talks to raise these funds. And BYJU'S isn't responding for comment around this issue, so we really don't know what's going on. But Financial Express reported that a few senior employees were briefed about the round on March 31st after the term sheet was signed. And after a term sheet is signed, that means it's pretty much official, it's a done deal, and it's just a bunch of technicalities that are keeping the cash out of the bank account, but probably in the next couple of days. If that's already happened, then BYJU'S will have that money in the bank. But at least $400 to $500 million of this amount is reserved for debt payments. And that is a huge amount, $400 to $500 billion out of a $700 million amount disappearing, going straight into repayment of debts. But I think this is something that investors seem to be okay with. According to these sources from the Financial Express, due diligence by the investors has been done, which means that there's likely nothing that investors took major issue with. They know what's going on inside of the company, and they're still willing to fund its growth in spite of what they're now aware of. And I would imagine that there are some problems, some things that they've seen inside of BYJU'S that they might not be happy with. But at the same time, they've already put so much money into this company that they're not willing to walk away and say, you know what, you're on your own. We're going to cut our losses here and leave you guys to figure things out for yourself. It seems like that's just not the mentality that they have. BYJU'S is now so big and they've poured so much money into it that they want to see an ROI. And so that's what this funding round might be all about. Now, one thing that I find really interesting here is this $22 billion valuation. And like I said, this is the third funding round in a row where they've had that valuation. So that means that their valuation for more than a year now has stagnated, which is not a good thing. Last week, I mentioned how Prosus reevaluated the valuation of their stake, but now we've also seen BlackRock slash BYJU'S valuation to $11.5 billion. And that was a week ago. So it did happen before this most recent $700 million funding round. If they had known that that was actually going to happen, they might not have published that information, that reevaluation of BYJU'S valuation, but there it is. You can clearly see that there are parties out there that disagree with BYJU'S $22 billion valuation, but it seems like the investors that participated in this most recent funding round, as well as BYJU'S themselves, want to keep that valuation as is, at least for the time being. But anyways, let's move on to some more positive, optimistic news now, because there's an Indian space tech startup that you've probably heard of at this point, Skyroot Aerospace, and in this last week, they accomplished something amazing. They successfully completed a 200-second fire endurance test on a new cryogenic engine that will power the upper stage of their Vikram 2 rocket. And so far, Skyroot has launched their Vikram S rocket, and that happened once, and their Vikram 1 rocket is scheduled to launch in the third quarter of 2023, but there's no clarity yet on when the Vikram 2 rocket might be launched in the future. All right, next up, let's take a look at some UPI-related news, and also we'll look at digital payments more generally, because the Unified Payments Interface of India is seeing some pretty heavy usage, actually unprecedented record-breaking usage. It saw 8.6 billion transactions worth 14.1 lakh crore rupees in March. That's about $170 billion for people who are watching this outside of India. And another little update on top of that, this is just a side note here, is that Apple is now accepting UPI AutoPay for subscription-based payments in India. So if you're someone who's been using an iPhone, this might be a huge relief for you if you've been paying for iCloud iCloud Plus to expand your storage, because now you can do that more seamlessly. And another little update related to Apple, I know this isn't really startup related, is that they're launching their first store in India this month in Mumbai. All right, now another little update in the digital payment space, although this isn't really related to digital payments, although we are talking about PhonePe here, is that they've launched something called Pincode. You might have heard of this, I'm not sure. It's making quite a splash. It's an ONDC app. And just a little aside here, I would imagine that that's an extremely expensive .com for them to purchase. Pincode.com is probably pretty desirable, so they must be pretty serious about this app. But what exactly is it? Well, like I mentioned earlier, it's an ONDC e-commerce app, and I'm just going to walk you through the website here because I think that's the easiest way to explain it. So it's an app for groceries, medicine, and food, among other things, and it allows you to shop from local trusted stores around you. Pincode payments are powered by PhonePe, of course, and they also offer easy refunds, which has been a problem for people who have used ONDC in the past. Now, currently this is only available in Bengaluru, but they're planning to expand into other cities in the future. And what I think is really interesting is that this marks the first time that there's a dedicated app by a player for ONDC. Other big companies have integrated their existing apps with ONDC, but there haven't really been any big companies who have launched something exclusively built with ONDC in mind, at least not until Pincode by PhonePe. Now, in case you're out of the loop on this, PhonePe actually recently secured funding worth $1 billion, which is being released to them in tranches, and they're actually considered to be now India's biggest fintech startup at a pre-money valuation of $12 billion. All right, next up, this is just gonna be a quick update, but bike taxis will soon be allowed legal in Delhi. And this is a pretty interesting 180 because in February, Delhi's transport department banned aggregators such as Rapido, Uber, and Ola from operating bike taxis. But I guess they realized that with such high demand, it's actually better for them to allow and regulate this space rather than ineffectively trying to ban it, which would lead to safety concerns for riders. Drivers would need to obtain a commercial service badge after having their antecedents verified by the police. All right, next up, I want to talk a little bit about this last financial year and what it looked like for Indian startups because it just ended. March 31st was the end of the financial year FY22 to 23, which we often just simplify to FY23, just in case you're not aware of that. And India's financial year is actually slightly different from financial years around the world. Every country tends to do it a little bit differently. Some countries do January to December. India does April to March. So that's the way that it's structured. So as we can see here, when it comes to Indian startup funding, and by the way, this is from NTracker, at the beginning of the calendar year of 2022, things were actually going really well. So that's the end of FY22. I know it's a little bit confusing, but Indian startups raised $12 billion during that quarter. But then from April to June of 2022, and that's Q1, quarter one of FY22 to 23, or just for short, FY23, funding went down to $7.7 billion. And then there was an all-time low of $2.8 billion between July and September, and then things slightly recovered to $3.4 billion, and then we wrapped up FY23 with the same, $3.4 billion. So in other words, things have kind of cooled off in the last year, and this is actually what it looks like when a funding winter is going on. According to NTracker, Indian startups are facing tough times amid funding crunch and mass firings. Now, something specific that I want to look at here regarding Q4 of FY23 is that India actually failed to produce a single unicorn. And I'm sure that you all remember how common that was in 2021. And also at the beginning of 2022, there were unicorns left, right, and center. Now, if we take a look at which Indian cities raised the most money in Q4 of FY23, we can see right away that Bengaluru was the leader, followed by Delhi, and then Mumbai. And this is pretty normal, but then if we zoom in specifically at the last month, March, the story is a little bit different because NCR raised the most money, followed by Bengaluru, and then Mumbai, according to your story. But now let's zoom in at just the last week. We've been getting a lot of comments from people saying that they want to see the funding news segment or the bird's eye segment like we used to call it. So we're going to bring that back. Let me know what you think, if you're happy with it, or if there's some changes that you want us to make. But let's jump in. So these are all the funding deals that I was able to track down from Monday to Thursday. And there's definitely going to be more by the time you watch this video, but I'm filming this video on Thursday, so this is all I was able to find. And as you can see here, the total amount is $917.4 million. Now, $700 million of this is, of course, from BYJU'S, and we can debate back and forth on whether they're considered a startup or not. But just a couple of notes here. Firstly, apart from light metrics, there really isn't a lot of funding action in the AI space, which I find surprising because the conversations that I've been having with VCs and founders in the real world lately are all about AI. It's all anybody is talking about. And I'm just going to shamelessly plug my Twitter here real quick because I made this thread looking at Stanford's recent AI report with, of course, a focus on India. They looked at the entire world, but I just wanted to zoom in on India because India actually has the highest AI skill penetration of any country in the world. In other words, Indians are better equipped to build AI than anybody else. But in spite of this, India is actually creating very few AI startups. Why is that? Well, I'll put a link to that thread in the description of this video. And by the way, if you're an Indian startup founder and you're building something here in India, then just feel free to DM me. I'm always looking to chat with Indian entrepreneurs, throw ideas around, hear what you guys are working on. You don't need to be an AI. You can be in any sector, but I'd love to hear from you. So I think that this whole obsession with AI will eventually be reflected in the funding news over the next couple of weeks and months as investors do their due diligence and actually start to pour some money into these Indian AI companies, although there aren't as many as some other countries like China or the United States. But anyways, looking back at the funding news here, I think something else worth noting is that Zero Cow Factory exists, and what they're doing is really cool. And I'm sure a lot of you guys feel this way, but I've always been disappointed by how cows are treated in India, especially it's India. It's supposed to be the land where cows are sacred, right? And it just doesn't feel that way. You often see cows eating trash on the side of the road. I filmed this video the other day while I was just on my scooter, and this is a very common sight, right? You see cows eating trash all the time. Their stomachs get full of plastic, and it's really sad. So imagine if India wasn't so reliant upon cows for their milk. Well, that's what Zero Cow Factory is trying to do. They're using biotechnology to create milk without cows. And I know that might sound a little bit silly. It might sound impossible. How can you have milk without cows? Milk comes from cows. But just remember that Beyond Meat and Impossible did this in the United States with meat, which is much more difficult, and specifically beef. And Americans love beef just about as much as Indians love milk and milk products. And so they're both bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue per year. And I think that the same thing could be achieved in India with a company like Zero Cow Factory. Now, another company worth mentioning here is Dozy, and I actually did podcasts with both of the founders of that company, Mudit and Gaurav, back in 2019, and their product has changed a lot since I talked to them. From a sleep health tool for consumers to a serious FDA-approved contactless vitals monitor for hospitals. And then the biggest round of the week besides BYJU'S was Dunzo. They raised $75 million in convertible notes, but at the same time, they ended up deciding to lay off 30% of their staff, which isn't great. And that's actually the note that I'm going to wrap this video up on. Thank you so much for watching this video. Sorry it ended on a little bit of a negative note, but I will see you in the next one.